pleasure to welcome Professor Minka Woerman here. She is University of, and she's Associate Professor of Philosophy and the head of the Unit of Business Ethics and Public Integrity in the Center for Applied Ethics at University of Stellenbosch. And we've just spoken about it. She's currently working on a second doctoral study in the field of visual arts, and part of what she's doing here is coming from that side. As you can see, the title of her presentation is Monumental Transformations and the Remembering of Meaning. Very interesting. Let me just say something about the procedure before we start. So the talk will be around 30 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be plenty time for discussion, 20 minutes more or less. If you have questions, remember to unmute yourself at the end. And otherwise, just write your question in the chat box and we will be checking that. All right, over to you, Minka.
Thank you very much, Abraham. And thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. My presentation is based on a chapter that I was invited to write for a forthcoming collection titled Monuments and Memory in Africa, and edited by Madalitso Piri and John Sani. At the time I received the invitation, I had not yet clarified my thinking on monuments, and this invitation gave me the opportunity to do just that. The first seed of an idea arose during a conversation with my art teacher, South African artist Hare, who during a discussion on the vandalism of monuments asked what would happen if we were, for example, to take the bronze bust of Woerman and move it to a quarry in the Karoo. How would this transform the meaning of the statue? This question sparked thoughts on the properties, beyond the obvious representational nature of statues and monuments, that endow these artifacts with meaning. So in the first part of this presentation, I shall argue that a meaning of a given monument cannot be comprehended properly without accounting for the philosophical framework of its production, that is, its symbolism, its temporal dimension, and its contextual dimension. I shall defend three claims to support this argument. In the second part, I shall argue that destroying colonial and apartheid artifacts need not equate with vandalism, but can instead open a generative space for rethinking the past in ways that could serve the decolonial project. I also investigate the political and philosophical nature of intervention, as well as the role of artist-activist and the conditions under which intervention would be justified. The primary theorists that will guide my thinking are post-structural philosopher Jacques Derrida and political and decolonial scholar Achille Mbembe. I shall also draw on the insights of South African artist William Kentridge and post-war German artist Anselm Kiefer. Aside from the bust of Woerman, two monuments of Rhodes, the statue previously situated on the campus of the University of Cape Town, and the bust displayed at the Rhodes Memorial Garden in Cape Town will also be referenced in my argument, for the reason that the figure of Rhodes became the central target during the Must Fall movement in 2015 and beyond. The first claim that I shall defend concerns the symbolism inherent to colonial and apartheid artifacts. As an entry into the discussion, I draw on Kentridge's insights presented in the Charles Eliot Norton lecture series at Harvard University, which he titled 6 Drawing Lessons. These mesmerizing drawing lessons offer a piercing political and philosophical reflection on the organization of history and place. Plato's allegory of the cave informs the subject of drawing lesson 1, titled In Praise of Shadows. For Kentridge, this allegory, wherein the sun represents the truth, serves as the pivotal axis of political and aesthetic concerns. Kentridge argues that for Plato, the relation between knowledge and power is central to the construction of the ideal state, wherein the philosopher gains the right and obligation to be king, which also implies the moral and political right to employ violence as legitimized through his proximity to truth. In this case, the philosopher has a responsibility to forcibly drag others out of the cave. The philosopher king, moreover, has the right in terms of what is seen and what is, whereas the prisoners in the cave are shackled in such a manner that they can only look forward, a type of forced looking. In their subjugation, they become subjects that are looked at rather than looking subjects. The history of colonial rule, or what is referred to in drawing lesson 2 as a history of enlightenment under domination, is the history of the Western subject as philosopher king. The subject who self-assured in his Platonic aspirations, and later the modernist belief that knowledge is power over both the other and nature, had forgotten the lesson of Icarus. Moreover, this subject had cast out its own shadows and imposed them on his double, the oppressed African, reduced to a crouched figure. Kentridge depicts this logic of oppression in his 1999 work, Shadow Procession, a video installation of an endless loop of silhouetted, subjugated figures. And here's a static image of that video loop. Compare this notion of a subjugated shadow procession to the representational nature of the Rhodes Memorial in Cape Town. This monument was designed by Sir Herbert Baker and modeled after a Greek temple. At its base is a bronze statue of a horseman, and 8 lions flank the steps leading to the bust of Rhodes. Inscribed below the bust is a stanza from Rudyard Kipling's poem, The Burial. The immense and brooding spirit still shall quicken and control. Living he was the land, and dead his soul shall be her soul. This monument not only celebrates Rhodes, but through the imagery and the inscription immortalizes and celebrates his legacy of control and domination. Yet, and with reference to the Rhodes sculpture that previously stood on the UCT campus in recognition of his patronage to the university, Mbembe remarks that nobody should be asking us to be eternally indebted to Rhodes for having donated his money and for having bequeathed his land to the university. The conditions under which Rhodes acquired the land are tied up with a colonial history of domination and subjugation, which in turn was produced and legitimized by a philosophical framework that we should both recognize and account for. Hence, my first claim is that Platonic hubris serves as the leitmotif of both colonialism and its embodied memory in monuments. My second claim concerns the role of time in determining the signifying potential of monuments. One of Zeno's famous paradoxes is that of the arrow. Zeno argues that an arrow flying through space must be at rest at every instant to occupy space. If everything is at rest in an instant and time is composed of a series of instants, then motion becomes impossible. Jonathan Culler, a Derridian scholar, argues that whilst this paradox is intended to demonstrate the impossibility of motion, what it illustrates more convincingly is the divided nature of time. The present position of an arrow is always relative to its past and its future trajectories. The present is thus a product of the relations between past and future, with the consequence that the present is characterized by difference in division rather than presence. However, as Roberto Poli, a complexity theorist, argues, we should not be fooled into thinking of the present merely as a thin interface between past and future. Poli instead speaks of a thick present, which refers to the present as a modality that has both some duration and some depth, and therefore rich and multifariously complex series of structures. To illustrate this claim, consider the case of the Rhodes statue at UCT that was targeted during the Rhodes Must Fall movement in 2015. This statue recalls both the colonial time of Rhodes, the late 1800s, and the socio-economic conditions of contemporary time, 2015. Moreover, and it's argued, the symbolism of this colonial artifact is also intimately tied to a philosophical history dating back to Plato. The contemporary signifying potential of the Rhodes statue is therefore also contingent on a very distant past that informed the colonial project and was instrumental in shaping the current path trajectories that were the object of revolt during the must fall movements. Lastly, we can also refer to the time when the monument was cast, 1934, as well as the present day in which this reflection is being undertaken. Time, in other words, is complexified with the consequence that the simple trajectory of the arrow, the teleology of truth, is revealed to be nothing more than a metaphysical construction. In addition to the laden present and presence of colonial monuments, it is also worth looking at how colonialization suspended time and how the decolonial project can reinstate time, understood as the process of becoming. Following Frantz Fanon, Mbembe argues that becoming human does not only happen in time, but through, by means of, almost by virtue of time. And time, properly speaking, is creation and self-creation, the creation of new forms of life. Mbembe further notes that to the extent that we can speak of a Fanonian theory of decolonialization, it exists in undoing the negation of time that characterized colonialism and replacing it with dialectic time, life, and creation. Regarding colonialization, Fanon argues that time was negated in three ways. Firstly, natives were viewed as people outside of time, not simply as people without a history. Secondly, the future was categorically closed off to natives in that the future belonged solely to Europe. And thirdly, natives were viewed as incapable of change and hence creation, and were therefore not only doomed to a logic of repetition, but became the instantiation of the very law of repetition. I think Kentridge poignantly captures this last point in his video loop, Shadow Procession, which not only demonstrates the underbelly of Platonic idealism, but also the relentless repetition that subjugation brought to bear on the African subject. In contrast, decolonialization opens time and hence the possibility of becoming human. It is, as Mbembe summarizes, the permanent possibility of the emergence of the not yet, which has the potentiality to reconstitute the human after humanism's complicity with colonial racism. Considering this, one can argue that colonial artifacts both do and do not recall time. Colonial artifacts recall time insofar as they embody a thick present and thereby draw attention to the complex layers of history as time. However, these artifacts also negate time in two ways. Firstly, and as explained, these artifacts denoted time in which the African's time was philosophically negated through erasure. In other words, they recall a time in which the opening on time and hence of becoming subject was denied. Secondly, the logic of monumentality is intimately tied to the logic of immortality, a desire that is explicitly reinforced in the Rhodes Memorial by the Kipling stanza. Mbembe explains that because monuments are the expression of humans longing for eternity or immortality envy, in principle they defeat and transcend time as such. Through them we delegate to the inert, the geological, the mineral, and the indestructible, that which otherwise might be but ephemeral, in this case, life itself. The logic of this double negation is very forceful and requires intervention through a type of temporal transplantation. So hence my second claim is that the embodied memory of history and monuments becomes thick and layered with time, while simultaneously negating time via strategies of erasure and transcendence. My third claim concerns the role of context in determining the signifying potential of monuments. An important shift that took place in the history of meaning concerns the move from intentionality to context as the source of meaning. In the traditional Platonic view, thought represents the realm of philosophy, which is then conveyed in speech. The relationship between speech and thought is assumed to be unproblematic and unmediated. I speak my thoughts clearly. The analytic philosopher J.L. Austin's speech act theory constitutes an attempt to move the source of meaning from the intentionality of the speaker to the context within which the speech act occurs. Austin argues that all speech acts are performative because they enact in context. Austin further attempts to specify the conditions under which speech acts lead to successful outcomes. He thus distinguishes between serious or successful speech acts and non-serious or failed speech acts. Derrida follows Austin in arguing that meaning is always determined in context. However, what he contests is Austin's understanding of context. For Derrida, one can never conclusively specify the criteria or conventions for successful speech acts because context can always intervene. In other words, Derrida argues that the conservative moment in Austin's speech act theory is exactly his attempt to bring context under our intentional control by stipulating the conditions for successful speech acts. According to Derrida, meaning takes place in context, but context is boundless. Context always introduces a difference that cannot be tamed by intentionality, and by implication, context renders signification excessive. This Derridian understanding of the iterable nature of meaning also applies to monuments. Indeed, and as noted by Sabine Marshall, semiotic and discursive analyses of public memory are common. In these analyses, the focus is on processes of signification, how messages are encoded in monuments and decoded or read by members of the public, and how meanings are framed and constructed through socio-political discourse. Marshall draws our attention to the fact that monuments are objects in space. In her words, monuments structure public spaces, direct our gaze, and channel us along specified paths. Mbembe argues that monuments claim ownership of space, that is a public common good. However, monuments not only take up space and appropriate public spaces, but they also exist in space. Although there's a relative stability to the meaning of monuments, determined by their materiality and the materiality of history, the signifying potential of monuments, including their intended symbolism, can be radically altered by changes in context. Take, for example, Niebuhr's question regarding the bronze bust of Verwoerd. This bust, got a picture of it. This bust was previously on display outside the municipal building in Meyerton and has been in storage since 2011. How the bust is decoded and read by the public in this institutional and political setting is vastly different to its signifying content in a Karoo quarry, for example. With reference to the appropriate contexts for problematic colonial and apartheid artifacts, Mbembe muses that a new kind of institution should be created, one that is partly a park and partly a graveyard, where statues of people who spent most of their lives defacing everything the name Black stood for would be put to rest. The desolate and harsh landscape of a Karoo quarry strikes me as an apt embodiment of Mbembe's hybrid graveyard park. Within such a context, the representational quality of the monument remains unchanged. We still recognize it as the same bust of Verwoerd. But the meaning of the bust, indeed its signifying strength, changes with its contextual transplantation. Thus, we see that the meaning of monuments, as with speech acts, is iterable. It is also important to note that the dimensions of space and time do not exist as exclusive categories. Contextual shifts take place in time, thereby further complexifying the signifying potential of monuments. My third and final claim is thus that the text of monuments, that is their signifying potential, are always already co-determined by context, and as such, contextual transplantation can alter their signifying potential. So having defended three claims concerning the nature of the signifying potential of colonial and apartheid monuments, I now turn to the second part of the presentation, wherein I address the destruction of colonial and apartheid monuments. As an opening remark, note that all acts of vandalism of these monuments are aimed at disempowering or undoing the Platonic hubris and the history of colonialism that followed in its wake. Marshall states that the term vandalism was first used in the context of the French Revolution with reference to the destruction of the symbols of the ancient regime, and that similar waves of vandalism took place during the English Reformation and the fall of the Soviet Union. This early understanding of vandalism accords well with what was my first intuition regarding the nature of the destruction of monuments, namely, that such destruction is a political act of signification intended to stop all future signifying potential of a given monument. In this regard, vandalism or destruction is synonymous with the obliteration of the monumental. The destruction of symbolic artifacts with the intention to negate the public memory of a given history is a practice that stems back to the ancient world. This practice is referred to as damnatio memoria, which translates as condemnation of memory. One example of ancient Egypt concerns Queen Hatshepsut, a self-declared pharaoh who was almost exorcised from history by his stepson and successor, Thutmose III. Although Hatshepsut's extraordinary reign remained a secret for centuries, her identity was revealed by archaeologists in 1822. Contemporary examples of damnatio memoria also abound. For example, Joseph Stalin rewrote history using photo altercation. His political enemies were routinely executed and scrubbed from photographs. Stalin famously ordered that Leon Trotsky be exiled and removed from all photos. Citizens were so fearful of Stalin's purges that they began to deface photos of Stalin's known enemies in their own books and magazines using scissors or ink. While both these examples point to the often dubious intent behind decrees of damnatio memoria, an argument for the obliteration of apartheid and colonial artifacts may well be forwarded based on the atrocities committed during these historical periods. Returning to Egypt, in 2011, courts ruled that images of the then ousted Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, and his wife be removed from public squares, streets, libraries, and other public institutions around the country. Sarah Bond argues that the erasure of figures from public artifacts could serve cathartic purposes if the population engages in the obliteration. This would also constitute a strong reason for the obliteration of colonial and apartheid artifacts, even if such obliteration is not aimed at damnatio memoria in any complete sense. However, Bond notes that if such erasures are ordered by the state, as was the case in Stalin's Russia and ancient and modern-day Egypt, then they constitute a further repressive practice. In Bond's words, erasing the crimes of the past doesn't help us avoid them in the future. It is exactly this state-driven drive towards a collective amnesia that artist Anselm Kiefer resists and challenges in his art. As reported in the documentary Remembering the Future, Kiefer was born in Germany in 1945. His childhood playground was thus constituted by the ruins of war, a fact that he was too young to appreciate at the time. For him, the devastation held a certain aesthetic quality, which is still evident in his work today. As a young artist, Kiefer began to probe excessively at the open wound of German history. At the age of 24, he met with controversy for photographing himself in his father's Wehrmacht uniform whilst doing a Nazi salute, which was banned. The only teacher to come to his defense was a professor who was interned at Auschwitz during the war. This professor, like Kiefer, understood the dangers of silence and denial. It was only after watching several documentaries on and interviews with Kiefer that I came to realize the mistake in my reasoning. Destruction is not necessarily obliteration. Destruction can also open a generative space for rethinking the past. In Remembering the Future, Kiefer speaks of this dialectic between creation and destruction. He argues that the nature of the cosmos is one of construction and demolition. Stars explode, but all the material goes back into the cosmos, only to be recomposed as new stars via the force of gravity. God does not forget. What is striking about all recorded acts of damnation memoria is their relative failure. Despite concerted efforts to obliterate a given history, traces always remain. Or in the words of Kentridge, time is thickened with material. Bond writes that the ancients knew how difficult it is to break free from the past. She notes that sculptures and carvings were sometimes recycled. After one emperor's face was obliterated, the stone could be recut to the likeness of the new one. Thus, whilst the destruction of monuments may not, as stated, always be aimed at full-scale damnation memoria, the challenges and implications of this practice lead to further reflection on the generative potential of destruction as an alternative to obliteration. As with the histories that they symbolize and in line with ancient practices, colonial artifacts can be viewed as clay, a malleable material that can be transformed and rethought in an attempt to deal with our own open wounds. Transforming, even destroying these monuments need therefore not simply be negative acts of vandalism. Rather, there's a potentially generative quality to transformation and destruction that opens new meanings, which feeds back into the past and forward into the future. As Mbembe remarks, decolonialization includes changes to the economy of symbols whose function all along has been to induce and normalize particular states of humiliation. Thus, monuments are not passive and should not be treated with apathy. Rather, and as noted in a conversation with Mbembe, political questions concerning what is remembered and who is doing the remembering always remain and may thus call for active intervention. Concerning the nature of vandalism as intervention, specifically, Marshall notes that it seems that ideologically motivated vandalism is targeted far more frequently at statues than any other kind of monument and symbol. She attributes this to the mimetic quality of people commemorated posthumously. The vandalism, she writes, becomes a form of posthumous punishment of the despised, an attempt to figuratively killing the legacy of their deeds and ideologies, often in a condescending or obscene fashion. For example, before the Rhodes statue was removed from the UCT campus, it was defaced with human excrement. Similarly, the nose was cut off the bust of Rhodes at the Rhodes Memorial in 2015, and the statue was decapitated in 2020. The head, which was found nearby, was reattached on Heritage Day of the same year. Note that two levels of resistance are at play here, namely political resistance and resistance to the philosophical or ideological conditions that enable or enabled a specific history. Derrida, with reference to the political force of deconstruction, reminds us that deconstruction or intervention is never only concerned with signified content, in this case, the statues of Rhodes that commemorate and hence signify the man himself. Rather, this politico-institutional problematic is imbricated in a larger set of challenges that question the codes inherited from ethics and politics, that is the philosophical framework. Whereas the political act of destruction or defacement is immediate, challenges to the philosophical conditions that give rise to a certain legacy are more deep-seated and more complex to address. Indeed, the decolonial discourse is aimed at the latter. Mbembe also recognizes the philosophical challenge inherent to the decolonial project in writing that the questions we face are of a profoundly intellectual nature. They are colossal. Mbembe further argues that if we do not develop a complex understanding of the nature of what we are actually facing, we will end up with the same old techno-bureaucratic fixes that have led us in the first place to the current cul-de-sac. This point is well illustrated by the toppling of figureheads and their commemorative statues during times of revolution. Often the immediate political challenge is not accompanied by an investigation of the philosophical conditions that led to a certain regime, with the consequence that the regime remains mostly unaltered post-revolution. One figurehead is simply replaced by another. Perhaps the most iconic example of this is the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Firdos Square on the 9th of April 2003, effectively signaling the end of Operation Iraqi Freedom. However, despite announcing the cessation of operations in Iraq in 2003, American soldiers remained in Baghdad until October 2011. Thereafter, Iraq remained divided, damaged, and unstable, which effectively created fertile soil for the rise of ISIS. In 2016, Kadhim al-Jubari, who actively partook in the toppling of the statue, lamented, "I ask myself, why did I topple the statue? Saddam has gone, but in his place, we now have 1,000 Saddams." Whilst I argued that there is a generative potential to defacement and destruction that is not captured by simply equating destruction with vandalism, it is, however, often the case that destruction simply amounts to vandalism, that is, to an immediate political intervention or deconstruction. Here I think artists like Kiefer, who are tuned to the potentiality of destruction, can help us move beyond this immediate political deconstruction. In drawing lesson 3, Kentridge reflects on the nature of monuments. He argues that the monument and the sign erected in memory of the event is an admission of defeat, inasmuch as we hand the responsibility of memory to the object. Memory becomes a kind of canned memory. In other words, the monument remembers on our behalf and we are let off the hook. So to intervene in monuments, to actively engage their performative potential is, I would argue, a way of taking up our responsibilities in remembering the histories of the symbolic artifacts. The question that now, however, arises is under which conditions can and should artists and activists intervene? In drawing lesson 2, Kentridge recalls the status of a Khoisan diorama that was displayed in the Natural History Museum for over 20 years. This diorama, which was exhibited between other dioramas of animals such as lions and quagga, elicited much debate concerning the colonial influence on the hunters and herders of the Cape, as well as whether the figures of the Khoisan were stuffed or cast. Kentridge argues that although it was established that the figures were indeed cast, in another sense, they are also stuffed specimens, akin to Sarah Bartman, who dubbed the Hottentot Venus, was exhibited across the world before being dissected and displayed posthumously. Restitutions of her remains, incidentally, only took place in 2022. Here we see another colonial operation at play, namely that of epistemic coloniality, which is a process of knowing about others, but a process that never fully acknowledges these others as thinking and knowledge-producing subjects. Today, the Khoisan diorama remains in storage in the Natural History Museum. Kentridge describes the state of storage as limbo, a space and time of indeterminacy as the diorama awaits further classification. Limbo, he argues, always renders understanding limited, contested, and inadequate. It is the unstable point between here and there, what was and what is to come. It is the gap between two certainties that challenges certainty. In a further conversation with Mbembe, he noted that aside from the grid of signifying properties determining the meaning of a given artifact, as I've argued, a similar grid constituted by time, space, and the politico-aesthetic impulse of the artist-activist also defines the moment of intervention. Both grids are live, but a certain configuration is needed to justify intervention. He argues, rightly I think, that the diorama of the Khoi sun should stay in storage, because presently the creative impulse is too weak to overcome the immense struggle to classify appropriately the status of the diorama. In other words, the two signifying grids, that of the diorama and that of the artist-activist, are not commensurate enough to allow for productive engagement, because the appropriate time and context for such engagement has not yet arrived. In this case, limbo is vigilance to the question of the other. Let us, in conclusion, return to the Rhodes statue at UCT. Like the Khoi sun diorama, this statue is also now in storage, and the meaning of its symbolism is arrested in time and in this non-space. However, here limbo constitutes the destabilization of the temporal and spatial signifying power of the statue. Disempowering the signifying potential of the Rhodes statue by keeping it in storage is, however, not the only possibility for challenging its meaning. There is a second option. Unlike the Khoi sun diorama, I would argue that the time and place for actively intervening in the Rhodes statue has arrived. We can, in other words, remake its signifying potential to demythologize certain versions of history. To find the proper place of history and subjectivity today sometimes implies identifying the generative space from which something new can emerge. This emergence is always simultaneously an act of creation and destruction, in which the imagined permeance of the monumental is demonumentalized. Regarding this imagined permeance, Mbembe writes, "What strikes me these days is the sheer vanity and stupidity of almost every single public monument, as well as the vacuity of the concept and practice of monumentality. Indeed, there is nothing, no material artifact on this earth that cannot be defeated. Recycling, resculpting, and reinscribing monuments is a way in which to put them in their place. Transforming or even destroying these works disempowers the idealism, indeed the hubris, defining these artifacts, and draws renewed attention to their materiality and hence their provisionality. Furthermore, and in contrast to Platonic idealism, creative intervention can draw attention to what Mbembe refers to as pluriversity, that is, knowledge production that is open to epistemic diversity. This is because the visual transformation of monuments can open that which has always been closed to the future, because in their very monumentality, these monuments reify a certain epistemic conception of the past. In this regard, generative destruction via creative intervention becomes a just act, one that is undertaken in the hope of facilitating a more just future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minka. This was very clear and concise and exciting at the same time. All right, there is enough time for taking questions. Shall we just go one by one after each other? Would you like to take more questions together?
I prefer one by one.
Okay. All right. Remember to unmute. If I don't see you, just unmute and speak up, please. I hear somebody preparing for a question. It is Siseko. Siseko, please. Remember to unmute. I think you're still muted.
Thanks, Abraham. We're all in the same room, and that's why I'm using Ryan's microphone.
I was really puzzled.
Indeed, Ryan has transformed into a black man overnight.
Yes, it's Zeno's paradox, yeah.
Exactly.
You speak what you don't speak.
Minka, thank you very much for the presentation. I found it quite insightful. But I just wanted to make a correction and then I'll do a follow-up. So Saki Batman was actually returned, her remains were returned to South Africa in 2002, not 2022. She was returned in 2002 through the South African Heritage Resource Agency. At the time, it was, I believe, led by Dr. Sibongile Masuku, who's now currently leading the UNESCO Cultural Sector Committee, on which I serve. So I just wanted to make that correction.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So the second thing that the question really is, I'm clear on the articulation of sort of monuments, the interventions that can be made as a decolonial strategy. But what I'm missing, and this is not necessarily a critique to you, but I'm pressing you to think a bit more critically about this. What I'm missing in the South African art history theorization of monuments, of public spaces, are other ways of seeing. So for example, if one were to read your bibliography, outside of Achille and Mbembe, there isn't any other African who predicates notions of memory on orature, orality, and oracy. And yet that is where, not only in the South African context, but across the Sahara, that is where we find a fundamental placement of not only space, but how space is negotiated. And I believe it was Coetzee in 88 in White Writing who was asking for an Adamic language in which Africa can be spoken to and speak for itself. And it is in oracy, orature, and orality where we can find that Adamic language. So I'm pressing you to think about modes of conceptualizing public space and public memory outside of the history of theorizing art history, space and memory, public memory, as we find it in the West. I'm pressing you just to think critically about that.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that is a very apt remark you make, the history of, the orality in Africa. But in a certain sense, there's a big juxtaposition on the one hand between the monumentality of stone and the sort of fleetingness of voice. So how does one institutionalize
to respond to that, Minka, to respond to that, and this is where I'm going. If we go to our languages, and I'll be very brief here, Abram, because I see Chris also has a hand. If we go to, and I'll use my own clan names, for example, and this is the case throughout, and there's a project that's being done by Professor Paulus Zulu at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where he's using aphorisms as well as names in terms of stitching particular histories in order. Now, if we think about the concept of Gwabulawayo, Gwabulawayo becomes Gwabulawayo because of Umzilikazi's great trek to Gwabulawayo. And Umzilikazi in the Kumalo clan, who becomes our Totem ancestor. Now, there's an entire historical and geographical conversation that happens as Umzilikazi leaves KwaZulu, going to Gwabulawayo, that is encoded in historical familial genealogy that is remembered and recited through names. And that's a history of more than 200 years, right? So when I'm saying I'm pressing you to think more critically about modes of theorizing, I think what often happens in South African art history is that we privilege systems of writing and thinking and languages that have been quote unquote the languages of science. And yet there are languages of science and remembering that span hundreds and hundreds of years across the names of our people in this country that embody the histories of this country, how geographies have changed, how histories have changed, how territories have been confiscated and lost and won, etc. And here I'm just using the simple example of Gwabulawayo. It becomes Gwabulawayo when Umzilikazi gets there. It was not Gwabulawayo prior to that moment, right? So yes, I get the monumentality of stone, but oracy and orature is fundamentally deeply rooted in the histories of Southern Africa. And I think it's important for us to think critically and carefully about how we engage with those histories, because in a way, this is a mode of epistemic erasure, in a sense.
I get your point. And I mean, it's you are correct in saying that it is a question that needs to be considered in more detail. So I don't have a on the spot comment, but perhaps if you don't mind, I would the references that you mentioned, if I could have access to those, that would be great for subsequent follow-up work on this theme. Would that be fine, Siseko?
Sure, sure.
Thank you very much. And also, yeah, thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Thank you, Siseko. Chris.
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much, Minka.
Hey,
and I'm so
Chris.
sorry I missed the first couple of minutes of your
No
talk.
problem.
It was a matter of time, which is something I wanted to ask about in your talk. So I really like your idea of changing the meaning of colonial monuments rather than just obliterating them through generative remembering. And then I was thinking about the first part of your talk where you talked about time and context. And I thought, well, the space and context is actually quite fairly straightforward, I would imagine. If you just signpost the space and context of Peter Dirk-Eys, for instance, talked about the nauseum or a museum of apartheid artifacts, where you would stick all the statues of these apartheid dinosaurs in one specific place, and people would know, okay, this is what happened, but this is a critical intervention, and it's quite obvious because of where it is that there's a sort of critical signification to these monuments. On the other hand, time is something that's a bit more complex, as opposed to the space and the context. So, for instance, Auschwitz, that space, everyone knows this is not a space to celebrate Nazi history. But the question is, at what point do you, so you were talking about things being left in limbo. What about the time? But I actually had a question when you were talking about Mbembe's idea of the erasure of Africans having no future, thought the native has no future and the native is outside of time. That's a certain reading that you get from Hegel. But on my understanding of British imperial policy and missionaries coming to Africa, imperialism was predicated on the civilization and upliftment of Africans, and they were, the whole point of colonization was to change these societies so that they could be developed. So it was all about their future, actually. The future of Africans was the very basis of the legitimacy of colonialism. So I would question that kind of understanding of Africans being outside of time. But more to the point, I was wondering, how do you know? What is the criterion that you know that something should come out of limbo? So, for instance, the Khoisan monuments shouldn't come out of limbo, you said, but the Rhodes statue could come out of limbo. So what is the right time to alter signification? Seems to be a very complex issue. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about on what basis you make that judgment about time.
Yeah, that's also a difficult question. So firstly, just about the future of Africans, which sort of like justified colonial involvement. I mean, it's like doing lip service to the concept. I don't think that in any way sort of negates Fanon's critique of time in the colonial context. Then what is the correct, you see the temporal, you're quite right in saying the context is easy. You know, you can have your graveyard park or the nauseous museum or whatever the case might be, but how do you intervene in time? And I'm not sure. I think like on the one hand, there's a sensitivity to how time influences understanding. That's another reason why I think obliteration isn't always the greatest idea. But and the examples I use, the Rhodes statue and the Khoisan diorama, are very juxtaposed. So it was an easy example in that sense. But I suppose I would be careful to specify the the exact criteria under which monuments or statues can come out of limbo. But I do think it has to do with the sort of sort of stakeholder engagement and stakeholder readiness and conversations around these sorts of things. I mean, what you don't want is that the artist activist, in a certain sense, replaces the philosopher king, you know, and makes these decisions on everyone's behalf. So I can only imagine that
or the
determining or the state, exactly, like Egypt. So I can only imagine that determining the right time for these sorts of interventions is a multi-stakeholder conversation, and one that must be driven by sort of humility in a certain sense. And so I mean, that's my best answer. It's still, I was thinking about this talk last night. The question of, you know, dealing with historical artifacts, monuments, problematic monument statues, it's vastly complex, and it's really difficult to know if your thinking on the matter is correct or not correct, because I think the conversation can go in many different directions. But at the end of the day, this is not your question, but you know what Mbembe says about like that the monumental strikes him as slightly absurd and stupid. You know, the honoring of political figures. I think, yeah, I don't know, maybe the answer lies there. This practice of monumentalizing is something that perhaps it's at a higher level, but perhaps something that one should interrogate as such.
Yeah, I guess it's the public reaction as well. So you act, you don't just wait, but you act, and then the reaction is part of the stakeholder engagement. You can see in the reaction of the public whether something's ready or not.
Yeah, I suppose so. But you know, one should also tread carefully. I mean, I can think that something like the Khoisan diorama is a very sensitive, you know, topic, and something that one. That's why I say humility is needed. It's not for the artist activists to determine the right time. It's for those who feel that their identity is in some way implicated by the diorama or monument or whatever, that should take the lead on the conversation.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. We have 7 minutes left for questions. Anybody else? So I may then interject, waiting for someone to ask a question. I'm going to ask a very simple, basic philosophical question. What do you mean by meaning? You spoke about signifiers, signification acts, but I'm struggling these days to find a good definition of the term meaning that make us speak meaningfully about it. We had a long talk about Quine a week ago, and how he questions meaning, and actually said the same thing in the end. It's generating the context, and still then, but what is generated there? So what I'm perhaps trying to go for is, in a more phenomenological fashion, you would say meaning has something to do with signification of concern, you know, how things concern us, how they bother us, what interest we have in them. That defines meaning. So you're coming perhaps from another corner. I think that is, in a sense, helpful because it will tell us how we will clash in the way we destroy monuments. For some people, it will still have particular meaning. It will never have for other people. So because they have different concerns and how to intervene, there is a very difficult, critical issue. So that would be why I would approach it, for instance. But I'm not happy with my own approach. So this is why this is an honest question. If you have a nice definition of meaning.
Yeah, no, I know, like meaning is it's a concept that we use quite glibly, but that is once one starts unpacking it. But I don't know how to I don't have a good definition of meaning for you, but I think, you know, often when we think about these statues or whatever, okay, there's the history behind it, the symbolism, but we also think of the meaning of the statues in terms of what they in terms of what they represent, both the person, representation of the person, but representation also of a history. And I think, I mean, what I tried to do with the first part is just to say, well, beyond the obvious representational qualities and also the history that's represented, there's also the dimension of this layered time and the dimension of context that influences the meaning. So rather than giving a definition of meaning, I try to look at the properties that determine meaning. But you're right, there's also meaning is determined in context, but we're also psychologically invested in meaning in a certain sense. And in that sense, the statues mean different things to different people. But I think, again, so what does this help? I think perhaps looking at these statues or monuments or the diorama or whatever, just taking these different properties that together constitute our engagement with these things into account allows, I think, for a fuller sort of understanding of, I want to use the word meaning, of what they symbolize in society. The symbolism isn't restricted only to the representational dimension, but beyond that, yeah, I will send you to the analytic wing of the department. Or
thanks a lot. Analytical philosophers tend to ask me that question, and then the debate starts.
What do you mean by meaning? What do you mean by context?
What do you mean by meaning? Yeah, exactly. But I think these are, they may look like no-brainers, but I think they are important questions, so we can try to get in the same page, because very often I think people miss each other. Mbembe himself, in his the text I referred you to, that Europe is not yet ready to interrogate the meaning of these monuments, and also of bringing them back to Africa. There's still missionary guys and epistemic guys that just wouldn't do justice to them. But that's another story. But that made me think. I will not abuse my chair here anymore. There are 3 minutes left for questions. Anybody with a last question? Not, so we might just be able to finish in time today. Then it's time to thank you very much. It's a great discussion and paper, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you very much, Minka.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for attending. I know it's a busy time of the year.
Thank you very much, Minka.